As we have seen over the past few weeks' lectures, fairy tales play an integral part in the formation of values and the expression of what is possible, whether that be in Venice, Paris, or Berlin. The Romantics were attempting to write tales that constructed and imagined the concept of the folk in the nationalist discourse for the middle class, that class who held the economic, social, and political power of the emerging nation state. The Grimm's tales were infused with their knowledge of medieval law and the traces of Germanic and Christian beliefs, values, and practices, and they played an ever-growing role in the socialization of children in established obligatory schooling. The tales elevated the idea of the folk as a revolutionary concept and permitted its audiences, the middle class, to imagine themselves as the lower class that had risen, or as those who could climb further through service, obedience, and loyalty to the upper class. A confusing revolution that identified and pronounced the benefits of change, but also indulged in the traditional hierarchies and heroic narratives that diminished the benefits of social progress. So the National Socialists sought to galvanize support for their ideological platform by eliminating class distinctions and replacing those categories with a racially charged concept of the folk as a single political body, with the political, economic, and social exploitation of class shifting to race as they scapegoated minorities as the exploitative class. The Grimm tales were integral to the Nazi concept of the folk, a concept which the Grimms had used to bring together the many states, principalities, dialects, and traditions together as the foundation for the German nation, and now is being reconstrued by the Nazis with a very distinct racist discourse. Political party names often don't align with their actual policies and beliefs. So, for example, the National Socialist Democratic Workers' Party imitated the platform and propaganda of the Fascist Party of Italy and infused this with their own romantic, racist, and religious ideology. The National Socialists, or Nazis, promoted themselves as a young and dynamic revolutionary movement that demanded cult-like fanaticism from its followers, complete with oaths to the leader. Utter obedience was demanded. There was very autocratic and authoritarian structures at its core, with a very strict control over the channels of information to control the discourse and manipulate the practices of that group. The Nazi use of the Grimm fairy tales was utilitarian, aligned with their propaganda, and tales were censored, they were altered, they were modified, excluded, while simultaneously being promoted as sacred texts. So this meant that the tales that were chauvinistic, violent, and emphasized the sacrifice of the individual for the collective good, or they were altered to demonize and allegorize those that they had labeled as enemies of the state. These were really in broad circulation and became essential parts of schooling. Under the National Socialists, the literary fairy tale was banned. Authors were no longer able to write fairy tales since these were labeled as sacred, and the tales that were still kept were altered by the propaganda office in what is termed its cleansing policy that revised the tales and treated them as if they were ancient relics, but still that they somehow needed to clean them of the impurities and those were removed. So the traces of the imagined Germanic past that were added and emphasized by the Grimms are further stressed, while the Christian traditions that the Grimms included are reduced in their scope. So most supporters of the Third Reich had little to do with the rural folk communities the tales were supposed to represent, just as the audience for the Grimm tales were primarily middle class. The folk and fairy tales were optimal ideological tools for what the Nazis called the racial and political education of the young. The Nazi penchant for the irrational also influenced the pseudoscience projects they funded, such as cosmobiology, Search for Atlantis, occultism, witchcraft, and werewolf research that was funded for military and state purposes. What the Nazis liked about fairy tales was that many of them already contained aspects of their propaganda that only needed to be further weaponized ideologically. The simplicity of the tales were unlike the literary tales of Andersen and Hoffmann that contained psychological depth, but rather the Grimm tales featured uncritical doers of action. Rather than promote reflective intellectual critical thought, they emphasized the traits and values of service and obedience to political elites. The Nazi propaganda office liked how the tales focused on youth that were disaffected. They were in broken homes, which is where they were able to find their most fanatic followers and provide them a new sense of community and importance within their ranks. The Nazis saw opportunity in pitting young, impressionable people against their parents and emphasized the importance of stories that featured this. They would even valorize those children who denounced their parents as enemies of the state for having said something disparaging about the Nazi regime, their figureheads, or their agents. In many of the grim tales, the children are in danger in their own home by outsiders who have entered in, which supported the Nazi propagation of xenophobic views and laws. These figures included evil stepmothers, sisters, brothers, and it was only the kind, loving, but sometimes strict father who was on the side of the children. So this image of the surrogate father, this is cultivated by Hitler and the Nazis, and in his party speeches, posters, photos, events, news, and films, he was really portrayed as the doting father of the nation whom all should blindly trust. So the depiction of protagonists in the tales as inherently and naturally superior, yet suffering under the exploitation of unworthy rivals, reflected the bitterness of the loss of the war and the blame that was placed upon the leadership as a betrayal of the military and the economic exploitation that was found in conspiracy theories that targeted Jewish minorities. So, for example, the young person was targeted by their envious rivals until the young person breaks from the family and matures, relying upon nature for help, which was then a confused image that the Nazis used to both promote a return to nature and the medieval past, while also claiming scientific, cultural, and engineering superiority, so those technologies of the future. So the Nazi worldview was based upon a struggle of races and competition for resources and domination, with clear winners who were rewarded with power and wealth, and losers who were eliminated. This was the basic plot line for many fairy tales, with the rise of the worthy and the elimination of the imposters. So in fairy tales, the relationships between genders, family, and society were uncomplicated, superficial, and simplistic, unrealistic, and utopic worldview that the Nazis really wanted to implement in their regime. For example, let's look at Cinderella. It would have been interpreted and emphasized in school that nature chooses Cinderella as the correct individual to match with the prince. They would have been told that nature opens itself up to pure people and to those who are devoted. Nature cannot be deceived or cheated. Nature tells the truth. Of course, they assume that they are the ones that are put rightly atop this natural order, and this belief justifies their acts of domination and elimination of others who they see in this struggle, this social Darwinist struggle for survival. In Nazi literary criticism, Cinderella is used as an example of how instinct, or blood, which is interpreted as genes, and race indicate her as the right one for the prince. So which was part of a broader discourse that eventually resulted in the Nuremberg race laws of 1935 that made interracial marriages and relationships illegal in Germany. So tales that ended in marriage as a happy end reestablished the patriarchal order and demonized the powerful political woman, who was often cast as the stepmother, and they were also often cast as foreign. So in essence, the role of fertility for the female was emphasized, while the prince needed to be assertive, the mothers needed to be sacrificial, the children needed to be industrious, and race represented as the kingdom needed to be chosen over family. So in summary, the Nazis emphasized fairy and folk tales that featured a heroic prince who strived and struggled to win the hand of the king's daughter, interpreting these in false biological terms of Darwinist struggle to match the best genes, improve the species, and perpetuate the race. They preferred tales in which the protagonist was assured salvation, that it supported a childlike naivete and trust in authority. They preferred tales that conceptualized the image of the folk as loyal, steadfast, courageous, sacrificial, humbly dedicating, and sympathetic, and in which the characters were clearly divided up between what they inferred to be an Aryan protagonist and with positive characters, and then alien others. They did not make much about the genealogy of the tale, but rather how they could use the tale to influence the youth to adopt their own worldview.